Well, good morning. That never gets old. I'm always jazzed up when that comes on and when it leaves us. So, welcome this morning. It's so good to hear you. History is talking, and I hope everyone is listening here. Welcome if you're in person, and likewise online for our live stream. And of course, this will be archived, and people can watch as they wish. It suits their schedule. This is the second day of our Miller Center debut of the Barack Obama Presidential Oral History here at the Miller Center. The center recently celebrated its 50th anniversary, its golden anniversary. And for the past half century, the center has produced approximately 800 interviews through its oral history program for presidents and others who come to us because we think the Miller Center has set the platinum standard for oral history. By 800 interviews, I mean 800 individual people, not just several people who are multiply interviewed in multiple sessions, but again, about 800 people total. And these come from the ranks of the most senior officials in American government, and also includes foreign leaders. My colleague Russell Riley has traveled abroad to interview foreign leaders, and occasionally they are in this country. And what we find is that journalists, authors, scholars, students, biographers, and maybe even most important, practitioners in government and in the military mine these some 800 interviews for the insights that they bring on the American presidency. And some of you may have seen this week as we released the interviews for the Barack Obama Presidential Oral History that the New York Times' Peter Baker, who is the senior White House correspondent for the New York Times, wrote in the Times this week, and this is a quote, "The Miller Center has conducted oral histories of every presidency since Gerald R. Ford, making it the nation's premier repository of original recollections of key moments in the modern White House." And as you can imagine, we were thrilled to read that description of us and that label of us. And a major reason for that is twofold, and we should mention that really the father of oral history here at the Miller Center was the late James Sterling Young. He founded the oral history program here. He chaired it for many years, and he passed the baton to my colleague Russell Riley. And Professor Riley is recognized internationally as one of the top and elite oral historians. And so I'm going to welcome Russell to come to the podium today, and he is going to introduce the next film clip. And I mentioned to you yesterday that we are especially excited this year in our release. This is the first project we've had that has a video component. So Russell, if you'll come forward and introduce the film clip.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank all of you for being here. That's a hard introduction to live up to. I spend most of my career asking questions rather than standing in front of audiences, and I'm usually very comfortable doing the former and not so the latter. Every interview that we do, we're interested in knowing something about the operating style of a president. Each president's operating style is as independent and is as unique as a fingerprint. It comes partly from upbringing, it comes partly from training, partly just from the psychology of the individual president. And so that's something that we always try to devote some attention to. The scroller you're about to see here relates to questions that we posed to General Joseph Dunford, who was, I believe, the final chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff under President Obama. We'll show that to you in just a second. One further comment that I need to make about this before we look at the clip, and that is there's a significant amount of labor that goes into distilling our interviews so that we can look at something like this. Unlike some interview projects where basically the entirety of the interview is deemed to be available and open to the public, our interviews are always conducted under a strict veil of confidentiality, and we have to observe the rules of oral history and the law of oral history, and allowing our respondents to look over their interview to decide later on what it is that they'd like to have us release out of those interviews. And I can say demonstrably, in the practice of doing this over 40 some odd years, this is a method that works. That by putting a veil of confidentiality over the interview, we create an environment of trust where our respondents feel perfectly free to speak candidly to history, understanding then that there may be some things that we'll talk about that they would prefer not to have come out for some considerable period of time. There are interviews, for example, that we did on the Ronald Reagan project that still have not seen the light of day. The reason I mention that is that anytime then that we want to go back in and grab a film clip or an audio clip, we have to do a very careful assessment of that, running the audio and video parallel to the cleared interview transcript, the words that are released by the individual, to make sure that we don't open anything that they've suggested to us they would prefer to have closed. So there's an extended process of trying to get those things cleared and available that goes into creating this. So that's a very long-winded way of introducing this clip. I'll be quiet and let the tech people run this here, and then we'll turn it over to Mara from, yes.
He never served in the military. How did you find his professional sensibilities about the issues that you were bringing to him? Was he?
I'll just say this. I'm not sure if any of you are constitutional lawyers or you've been around one, but President Obama read everything we gave him. He asked many, many questions before he ever came into the Situation Room. I never saw him unprepared, and I never saw him attend a meeting where he didn't have a pretty clear understanding of what the outcome of that particular meeting was going to be. And I'm sure you have heard this from many other people. So, his lack of military experience, I don't recall thinking about once during my tenure. I don't recall one time saying, you just don't understand. Keep in mind now, I became the chairman almost in year 7 of his presidency. So he is a very experienced president at this point. He's dealt with the issues of Iraq and Afghanistan, ad nauseum at this point. And so his grasp of the issues, his understanding of the nuance of the issues and so forth allowed for a very, I would describe it as a very mature dialogue. And I never found him wanting for understanding on these issues.
Well, I am very excited to start our panel discussion here today. Very excited to be here with John Brennan and with General Jim Clapper. I am Mara Rudman. I have been associated with the Miller Center here for a few years, first as a Schlesinger professor, and then as a practitioner, and now as a practitioner fellow. And the reason I'm most excited to be here with these two, though, is I've had the experience of working with them because I, too, served in President Obama's administration in his first term and worked on the transition some with John Brennan, the transition into President Obama's administration. I'm going to only be able to pick highlights from their careers in this introduction because since combined we have more than 100 years of service, or nearly that.
Jim has 80, though.
Thanks for that.
Just the gravitas. No, but among the reasons I'm excited is the really special combination of long-serving career experience. They certainly were political appointees in President Obama's administration, but they came to that position, and I would argue part of the reasons they were chosen for the positions they had go to their deep experience across administrations, Democratic and Republican, as career officials deep in the intelligence, national security community. So just again, some highlights, and I hope to further pull those out during our conversation. John Brennan certainly here today for his service in the Obama administration as both director of the CIA, and when I worked most closely with him as the Homeland Security advisor for President Obama, and he worked on that transition as well. But under President George W. Bush, I believe, your work with PTIC was setting up he helped to set up what is now the National Counterterrorism National Center on
National Counterterrorism Center.
Thank you. NCTC, right?
NCTC.
Right. Going to those initials. In addition to having a career service in the field as well as in Washington at the Central Intelligence Agency. Jim Clapper, certainly longest serving, and we'll talk a little bit about the significance that had to be the longest serving director of national intelligence for President Obama, over 6 years in that term. Before he took that job, the combined length of time of previous DNIs, or the average combined, was about 52 months. So the difference...
Well, that was for the first three.
For the first three, right. Just in terms of continuity. Previously, though, he had served as Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, and also, and we'll talk about this, in a key reorganization of what became the National Geospatial Imaging Agency, NGA, again, in previous administrations. And so I'm eager to plunge into this conversation. I also want to remind folks that we'll take questions from the audience, both online and in the room, that I will either be weaving into the conversation as we go, but also really try to preserve at least 15 minutes at the end for all of your questions. So feel free, you've got cards and other ways of getting questions in, and we look forward to having them. Let's start with transitions, because certainly the transition, and was discussed some last night, from President Bush to President Obama, highly lauded. Interested in your perspectives on that, but also on previous transitions, and not only in how it worked, but why, from the positions you've served in, can you explain to us why it's such a sensitive time for the United States, the transition from one administration to another?
Well, each president and administration that comes in inherits a number of programs in the intelligence world. And so it's incumbent on the team that supports that incoming president to make sure that they get up to speed as quickly as possible between the time of the election and inauguration. Remember back in 2000, when it was uncertain who actually won the election, it really compressed the amount of time for the Bush administration to come in. And my experience working across 6 different administrations, 3 Republican, 3 Democrat, is that, especially on the intelligence side, you always want to make sure that there's going to be no break in support for the current president as well as for the incoming president. So what has happened in the past is that the outgoing president will authorize the president-elect and a team of people he has to start to receive intelligence during that period between the election and the inauguration, which is critically important because on inauguration day, that new team all of a sudden is in charge and needs to make sure that they have capabilities, the knowledge, the understanding of what it is that they need to deal with. I was very fortunate to be part of that Obama transition. I had finished my first government career service in 2005, went off to the private sector, and this young senator from Illinois decided to run for the presidency. And I was a long-distance advisor. I had never met him for election. But soon after the election day, I went out to Chicago and talked with him, and he asked me to be part of this transition team. And so during that period of time, again, between early November to January 20th, the Bush White House, the Bush administration, could not have been more gracious, more supportive, more generous with their time in terms of making sure that we were going to be as fully knowledgeable as possible about what we needed to do once President Obama was inaugurated. It really was a testament to what democracy really should be. Here's a Republican president who is going to be turning over the reins of power to an incoming Democratic president, and those people had differences of view, quite public differences of view. But there was no sense of any type of partisan bickering or effort to try to prevent the incoming administration from getting up to speed. So my predecessor in the White House, the UVA law school graduate, Ken Weinstein, spent enormous amounts of time with me in his office going over all of the material that was needed, and it was critically important, particularly on Inauguration Day. As you well know, Mara, the intelligence community had picked up some intelligence that they were
Warning, we have a little different view of Inauguration Day than may have been expressed last night.
not a different view, but a different experience, okay?
Yeah.
Because we had to deal with a threat about there were going to be attacks in Washington, D.C. on Inauguration Day. So we were doing everything possible, working with the outgoing Bush administration. And I remember being inside of the White House in the Situation Room about 6 a.m. on Inauguration Day. And the outgoing team also gathered shortly thereafter with us. So you had the Chief of Staff, Josh Bolton, and a number of others. And also take this opportunity to say Bob Mueller was in that Situation Room. Bob Mueller is one of this nation's true heroes. A wonderful man, terrific leader, outstanding director of FBI, and passed away last week. He deserves all of the plaudits and appreciation that this country has because of his 12-year tenure, not only as FBI director, but also when he was a Marine, prosecutor, and so on.
And as FBI director, he reformed counterterrorism.
So that day, we were there inside of the White House, and we were, again, monitoring intelligence that was coming in from overseas. We were in touch with the local authorities and police. My office was right below the Oval Office. It was in sort of right by the West Wing, right away near the Situation Room. Spent the entire day watching the TV and making sure that everything was being done, orchestrated, and it was particularly important during that period of transition. And again, that's why when we were finished up in the Obama administration, President Obama wanted to make sure that our transition to the incoming team was going to be even better or stronger or smoother. And as was mentioned yesterday, we prepared so much, but the recipients were not as eager, I think, to receive.
Well, it does show that, an element from what I hear from you and from what I've experienced in transitions working is, yes, all the planning, but also receptivity, recognition from both the outgoing and the incoming of the importance of the seamlessness. Jim.
Well, I think emblematic of maybe a high watermark of transitions was Bob Gates, who was Secretary of Defense, getting held over, which had never happened before in the history of DOD. I was then Undersecretary of Defense. When the election happened, I actually didn't pay a lot of attention because I thought I was done with the government.
Because you'd been pulled back in a couple times already, right?
Bob and President Obama had a little conversation in the hangar at National Airport, and I was on one of my many farewell trips overseas, and I was in Wellington, New Zealand, and I got a call about 3 o'clock in the morning. I'd been warned by OSD cables I'd get a call, and that Secretary Gates was going to call me, and I figured, thanks for your service, that kind of stuff. And instead, he asked me to stay on as under. So on Inauguration Day, I was in a cave at Fort Ritchie because Maryland, which is an alternate, location for U.S. leadership, and Bob was the designated survivor. So he was in Norfolk or someplace, so I got to be, for one day, acting Secretary of Defense. So that's why I remember that vignette. And I, spent the day glued to the TV, and I don't know, I think it was Sean last night maybe, or Tom, one or the other, were talking about just the atmosphere on the mall, and it was even watching in a cave on a television set, you could pick that up and absorb what tremendous expectation and the hopes that people had, represented by President Obama. So I observed from afar the transition that John was speaking of. I would say, as a general comment, having served at Intel for a long time, that you really didn't notice much. I never did, at least in the military, when we had transitions from one party to the next. there was always a certain continuity, I thought, certainly from an intelligence standpoint. And it was the intelligence community's job, as it was during this transition, to make sure the country was safe and secure, what potentially is a vulnerable time.
Thanks. And what I'm going to, and throughout this, try to do it, just did some key points. I'm both a moderator and was interviewed and part of this. So I would just say on the transition, my experience and where I got to know John was I was part of what was, for that transition, just a 5-person National Security Council focused transition team, which is pretty small. And in that context, there was another earlier conflict going on in terms of Israeli actions in Gaza. And so in talking to Elliot Abrams, who was a deputy national security advisor for President Bush and had, among other things in his portfolio, the Middle East. And I think Elliot would be comfortable with my saying we come at things from fairly different ideological places. He would probably want me to say that, in fact. But not only did he kind of take me in and have regular conversations, including about thoughts on how the National Security Council staff should be reorganized, the mistakes they had made. So it was both on the process side, things he thought that should happen better, but on the specifics in terms of actions in Gaza, he not only spoke to me regularly, but he put me on their open side group email list. And so that I could have real-time, again, open source information on how they were communicating with one another. So that was, like, just to me, the tangible sense. And I think there were some people in the Obama campaign who were shocked and a little not sure that this was, the best thing, though I think the transition team understood the importance of it. Let's go to the time in the administration. It's a big overarching question, but then we can dive down deeper. From your experience, certainly in very close proximity with President Obama, but having served other presidents, what would you say that he was particularly effective at, what he did particularly well in the national security intelligence space? And then I'm going to ask you, as you're thinking about that, also what things could have been better.
He was a wonderful listener and wanted to learn as much as he could. He had been in the Senate for a short period of time. Foreign relations, still, the world's a big place, a lot of complicated issues that he inherited. And so he was a voracious reader, as Joe Dunford said. Everything that was given to me, he was so well prepared. He had lots of questions. And so I saw that at first several months and year, it was really a steep learning curve for him. And he relied on people who had some experience. Given that I had served 25 years at CIA and the intelligence community, I think that's one of the reasons why I was brought in to the White House as his counterterrorism, Homeland Security advisor, because I could help to translate and also explain to him some of the things that were happening in the whole intelligence community environment. So, but he really recognized that this was going to be a journey, presidential journey, and he had to get up to speed as much as possible. And, the first month or so, he's hit with so many requirements and requests, whatever, and executive orders and other things. And one of the things that I was surprised at, there was early on, Greg Craig was the White House counsel at the time, and there was an EO, an executive order, that said that Guantanamo was going to be closed in a certain period of time. And I hadn't seen that beforehand. I said, what? How is that going to happen? So there's just...
Did you see it when it was still in draft, or you didn't see it until after it was out?
My recollection, I didn't see it before it was processed and signed. And so then there was a lot of, effort to try to make it happen, but I think it was fairly early that we realized that it was not going to be achievable. So there's just a lot of things that are happening, just getting the cadence of meetings, the National Security Council meetings, setting up the National Security Council meeting schedule, the Principals Committee, Deputies Committee, and all the other committees. So there's a lot of people who are coming in who don't have that experience. And so the first several months, we are still working things out. Just like in the Bush administration and George W. Bush, 9/11 happened when they were just in office a little over 8 months. And they were still, I think, trying to figure out exactly how that whole national security apparatus needed to work.
And it's interesting that happens kind of almost regardless of the experience of people coming in. Because with both Obama and with Bush, there's certainly bringing in people who had that. But I joke that, and it's not such a funny joke, but that the first year of an administration is like July in a teaching hospital. Like there's the new rotation coming in, and you've got to navigate through it, but with particular responsibility in your spaces.
So when I showed up, it was like 16 or 18 months into the first term, and we were President Obama and I were complete strangers to one another. I didn't know him, he didn't know me. Hadn't gone through any of the campaign transition like John did. And I was blown away by how astute President Obama was about intelligence matters. Intelligence it's important, sure, but it's just one facet of what the president has to worry about. So I was really impressed. I think going in, President Obama was probably a little suspicious of the spies. But I think John did a lot to allay those concerns. And I think one observation I'll make is President Obama, without fail, regardless of where he was a faithful reader of the PDB, the President's Daily Brief. So the practice we followed was not to rebrief or regurgitate the PDB, but I'd use the time in the Oval for briefing other things or amplifying or clarifying things that were in the PDB. And my observation was that at the end of President Obama's two terms, I would characterize him as an authority on the U.S. intelligence community, not just its output, which is what typically presidents want to know, analytically what's going on in the world, but also a profound understanding of how the intelligence system worked is really impressive. I think Joe Dunford had it right. Neither of us ever saw the president unprepared. When he walked in that sit room, he'd done the homework, he'd read up, he knew the issues. And for me, kind of intimidating because he's the smartest guy in the room every time.
So let's explore that a little bit. One of the points that was made last night was that time is such a precious resource for any president. No matter how big the staff is, there's still only 24 hours in the day, and what you put in and when. And you both had the experience with President Obama and John, other presidents for you, in that in seeing them function during that presidential daily brief time. Because in other words, that's it's both a document that goes into the president, and it's a time, generally somewhere on the president's schedule, meant to be daily, whether it always occurs that way is the question, that is reserved for discussing some of the most sensitive, most important issues as they've come up through the presidential daily brief. So explain a little bit about differences in how that time can be used and what makes the most effective use of that time, understanding that it may change from president to president.
I was President Clinton's daily intelligence briefer, the PDB down. And back then, that was the first time that they saw the PDB. So I would be sitting with him while he would read through it. No, it wasn't electronically submitted. So I would sit next to him and he would go through the PDB and then he'd ask questions or I would add things to it, augment whatever was in the book. President Clinton still does have a mind like a computer. Photographic memory, amazing ability to absorb things, retain it. I would brief him on something one day, and then 3 months later he'd say, "Isn't this the same guy?" And I had long forgotten about it. But I mean, so it was quite intimidating to be there with the President of the United States, and usually the Vice President is there, the Chief of Staff, the National Security Advisor. So they try to use that time, whether it's 20 minutes or a half hour, or sometimes it's just going to be 10 minutes because during the George W. Bush period, and then also during Obama's period, they may have already read the PDB, and they may have some questions. President Bush was very interactive. He wanted to have analysts and maybe operations officers from overseas come to the Oval Office and sit and chat and explain things. He was very interactive. President Obama, during his first term, I would be there at the PDB sessions, but I also would see him 3 or 4 times a day in terms of other things that I had to run up to the Oval Office at. And even at night, he would always try to make dinner with his family. So 5:30, 6 o'clock, he'd go off. But then I would be there late at night, and so 9:30 or 10 o'clock, I'd have to bring up something to the residents, and he'd be sitting there in the room and watching a basketball game with a big stack of papers or whatever and marking them up and reading and whatever, and I would brief him on something if I needed to get approval on it. So, a president's day is really 24/7, and it's nonstop that things happen and he needs to be notified. And so the toughest thing for me was to figure out, okay, when should I interrupt his family time and go up and tell him? But always, if I did that, he never said, why are you bothering me? He said he wanted to be informed about it. So again, each president has their own style, but every president that I worked for and served, and Jim served president since Grant was the first one. And I think they all valued intelligence. And we frequently, Jim and I would joke, we would be the skunk of the party because the policymakers would be going down one road, and then all of a sudden the intelligence guys come in and say, if you do this, be prepared to expect that. But they always appreciated and respected the service and the capabilities and the input from the intelligence community.
That reminds me, I think, an important point about President Obama. There is the bumper sticker cliche about truth to power in the intelligence community. And that was actually pretty easy for me as a DNI because the president insisted on that. And he told me from the first meeting we had that we were to provide the unvarnished, untainted, unbiased, unprejudiced, as objective and accurate and relevant intelligence as we possibly could. Now, sometimes people in the White House didn't appreciate that. Like your policy and country X ain't working, which is normally is oftentimes the role of intelligence. I always thought we were the throat clearers. To start NSC meetings, they always have intel. So the two bad guys were John Brennan and me, and I always wanted John there, so I wasn't by myself.
Take a blame on him.
Giving the bad news.
But just to be clear on that, it means that you're giving that bad news not just necessarily to the president, but those policy leads are in the room, hearing that their ideas are not going to work in terms of the direct interaction, or that there is problem X, Y, or Z that they need to be informed of.
That's why Obama really always wanted to hear it. And I'm a very bad poker player. My face gives away my emotions all the time still. And in the Situation Room, we'd be going around and the policymakers are there saying something, and I'd be going, and I wouldn't say anything, but Obama would say, okay, Brennan, what's your problem with this? Because he wanted that.
Yeah.
He really believed that he was not going to be able to do his job appropriately unless he heard all of the perspectives and input from the people supporting him.
We had a conversation once about dissent in the intelligence community, something we didn't do very well in the infamous weapons of mass destruction in Iraq National Intelligence Estimate of October 2002. I remember that because my fingerprints are on that NIE. And he said, if all you people in the intelligence community agreed all the time, you'd be very suspicious. And he was right. So he wanted, if there was valid, rational dissent to be had in the intelligence community, he wanted that prominently displayed in the PDB. Just to emphasize John's point about he wanted to hear all the news, bad and good.
So let me ask the two of you for a little bit of a 101 for the American public on what do the American people need to understand? Because this is necessarily and often behind closed doors and deeply vaulted in terms of intelligence information, highly classified. But what do the American people need to understand about why it's important to put resources into the intelligence community? What the kind of purpose and function is, because obviously they're tax dollars, our tax dollars, that are going to this, and with various arguments over time about what gets funded throughout the U.S. budget. So explain to us a little bit why the intelligence function is as critical as this.
Well, I think, let me start,
Please,
John,
please.
and you can police up the battlefield as you always did. I think the fundamental purpose of intelligence, I think, is to reduce uncertainty for a policymaker, decision maker, whether that policymaker or decision maker is in the Oval Office in the White House, or if I can stretch the metaphor, in an oval foxhole in a battlefield someplace. The objective is the same, to try to reduce risk for decision-making, which could involve, and often does, lives. And intelligence will never eliminate uncertainty. Anybody, it's the old saw about the difference between mysteries and secrets. Intelligence is pretty good at secrets, not so good at mysteries. And President Obama fundamentally understood that difference. But I think why should the American taxpayer be willing to invest $100 billion or whatever it is now in intelligence? It's that purpose. Now, that assumes, the classical post-World War II leadership position that the United States occupied, and a leadership role in the world. There's some question about that now. And I'll also highlight the importance, when it's functional, of congressional oversight. The American public, unfortunately, cannot be exposed to, what everything the intelligence community does. And if it were, we wouldn't have an intelligence community anymore. So the obligation and responsibility of functioning oversight committees in both the House and the Senate is to represent the American public and to ensure that what the intelligence community is doing is legal, moral, and ethical. Sometimes they do that, sometimes they don't. But rational oversight is extremely important to ensure that the American public is getting its money's worth. John?
Yeah, the American public wants to know about the weather every day, right? Every hour, there are hourly weather forecasts or whatever. Want to know what it's going to be like today, tomorrow, but also next week, maybe even next month. And in many respects, I see, the intelligence community being sort of similar in that regard. What are those formations that are happening that are going to possibly affect us in a very devastating way or whatever? Is it going to be bright? Is it sunny or rainy or whatever? And so over the course of the last, certainly 60, 70 years, the intelligence community has been able to pull together the capabilities that are able to detect the changes there and the variables and the factors that influence what it's going to look like, a week, a month, a year down the road. The challenge for intelligence community people is, there are variables that people inject. What Vladimir Putin might do, what Xi Jinping might do, what the President of the United States might do. Those variables have tremendous influence on what happens and how it's going to perturbate then the entire environment, the national security ecosystem. And so I think, since Jim and I have been in the intelligence community, we've seen tremendous evolution and growth in capabilities because of the technological revolution that has taken place. And so you'd like to think that the American people are going to be relying on those men and women from across the 50 states who serve their country, either here domestically in Washington or around the globe, in order to identify those trends, those developments, those conditions that really could affect us very fundamentally, as we're seeing right now in the Middle East. But still, it's going to be up to a policymaker to decide whether they take that information about that forecast or whatever, as well as the implications of some of their actions, and whether or not they're going to then be persuaded or going to basically disregard that input. And it's up to the policymaker, up to the president. And as we, I think, see, that the President of the United States has enormous executive authority. Commander-in-Chief, the chief executive of the entire federal government. And one of the things, again, with President Obama, he really recognized just how responsible he was for everything. And all of his moves, he was always playing four-dimensional chess. Because he, I think more than any other president I served, he would be 2 or 3 or 4 steps ahead. If we do this, this is going to happen, they're going to react this way, so what are we thinking about over here? He recognized the interconnectedness of that national security environment, and if we do something with one of our allies or say something about them, how are they going to then react and respond? So again, intelligence is supposed to be able to give them the eyes and ears that they need in order to understand what's coming forward.
Of course, there's only 2 conditions in life: intel failure or policy success. No other condition.
You can feel the scars from both of you of some of these internal discussions. I can see you remembering them. So let me ask you this in terms of intelligence priorities and the interaction with policy. And we were talking about this, Jim, a little bit before in the green room. And tying together that there are always limited resources and always questions about what gets funded and what doesn't. How do you determine, with the United States and its responsibilities around the world to keep the American people safe, where and how intelligence priorities get determined, and where the balance is between signal intelligence, human intelligence, imaging, doing so?
Well, you want me to start?
Please,
The
please.
Director of National Intelligence.
The first point I think that should be made is intelligence, despite the impression, is not a self-licking ice cream cone. At least it's not supposed to be. There are various processes, and I don't know how it works or if it does, because I'm 10 years out, but through my time, at my 50 plus years in Intel, there were various mechanisms which basically allowed for and required policymaker input. During my time, it's what's called the National Intelligence Priority Framework, which allegedly requires cabinet-level input on what intelligence community is supposed to do. What are the priorities? China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, whatever. The intelligence community is not supposed to do that all by itself in a vacuum. Now, the only time I actually saw this work was after Edward Snowden's revelation. And the cabinet department heads got very interested in, hey, what are you up to? Particularly with respect to SIGINT tasking, signal intelligence, conducted by the National Security Agency. So we went through a number of painful but useful exercises where and either cabinets, secretaries, or their deputies met in a series of meetings in the NSC to look at actually what are the priorities and where are the resources being allocated. So once that process happens, and it's normal at best an annual thing, then ostensibly, that's one of the reasons for the existence of a DNI, Director of National Intelligence, is then to take that and translate that into how that applies across the so-called intelligence disciplines of signal intelligence, human intelligence, et cetera. And during my time, 6 year plus as DNI, we had a fairly elaborate mousetrap built into my staff, a PA&E function, for those of you who are DoD fans, program analysis and evaluation, to actually assess what parts of the intelligence community were actually productive for what. Now, a lot of times this is a function of the laws of physics, what could be collected from our overhead system versus what could be collected from human intelligence versus what could be collected and analyzed from the geospatial intelligence, et cetera. And so it's a kind of a complex process. It is by no means perfect. You can't say to yourself, when I get up tomorrow, that all 100,000 billets in the intelligence community are allocated perfectly as they should be. Well, of course not. It can't. The system just doesn't work that way. Each year you have to request of the Congress appropriations, and the Congress allocates down to individual billets as to where they'll go. So the Congress, at least used to, had a very important role to play in the allocation of those resources. A lot of people are involved, lots of moving parts. But if the system works, generally speaking, you're going to allocate the resources to what you intuitively would think are the primary threats. The usual suspects, China, Russia, terrorism, Iran, North Korea, etc.
Until 2004, the director of CIA was also the director of Central Intelligence, of the intelligence community overall. And the role of the Director of Central Intelligence at that time, now the DNI, is to try to ensure there's going to be orchestration, synchronization, harmonization of all of those elements of the intelligence. I am so glad that when I became Director of CIA, I was not also the Director of National Intelligence and Central Intelligence, because Director of CIA is a full-time job itself. And The CIA was started in 1947, and it's been, going on for some time. And there's been a lot of capabilities and legacy systems or whatever that have built up. Each one of those agencies wants more and more and more. Want to do more signals intelligence, want to do more human clandestine collection, want to do more geospatial imagery, whatever. And the DNI is the one who's supposed to be saying, listen, we need to make sure that we're going to be an ecosystem that is going to be empowered by each part of it. And we need some redundancy in some places, but we also don't want to be just pushing more resources over here when, in fact, open source now is a better collector of these intelligence requirements and capabilities. The thing that bothers me a lot in the government was when just people are saying, well, our budget is increasing by 10% next year, or 8% or whatever. It's like there's really a need, and I think both Jim and I were involved in efforts to try to re-engineer some of our agencies and our systems so that we would be optimizing the resources we had as opposed to just layering on more money and wasting more money, building up an unwieldy system that is not internally cohesive and is not maximizing, again, the inputs of resources and personnel, whatever else. So the real key for, I think, the intelligence community is to make sure that we're taking full advantage of all the exquisite bespoke capabilities of the different agencies, marrying them together so that the sum is greater than the individual parts.
So I want to continue on the re-engineering line, but I just have another question to kind of layer in here in terms of how you, given the kinds of planning and historically understanding it may not work that way right now, but that you go back and forth with Congress, you have the annual appropriations, but things happen in the world. So I was noting even in the introduction to this, the description of this panel focuses on post 9/11, Afghanistan, Iraq. But in fact, things were changing with Russia, things were changing with China during that period of time, any number of kind of immediate issues. And so what happens when you've got your allocation, you've got your sense of directionals for the next 4 years, 8 years, or year to year, and you get told we need better answers on X, Y, or Z that's not on that list.
Yeah.
What do you do?
Well, from a programmatic standpoint, at least my approach was, let's acquire hardware, particularly in the overhead system or national technical means, that provided enough agility, flexibility, and adaptability that you could turn that battleship fairly quickly. The real power, though, is in the people. So if you have a Brazilian Navy analyst and all of a sudden you have a crisis somewhere else, and sometimes you need to move people around, well, you're dependent on the great men and women in the intelligence community to respond to that. Everybody's got to be someplace programmatically. You have to have all those billets accounted for. But when a crisis comes up, then you need to adjust. And I think, not to blow smoke, but I think one of the attributes of having a DNI is the ability to help orchestrate and coordinate that so that each component of the intelligence community is not off doing its own thing from a crisis management standpoint, and there's some integration and collaboration, which is not a natural bureaucratic act. And that's something I always felt the DNI needed to foster and champion.
Let me ask on that, because there have historically, before you took on the role, been a fair amount of tension between the CIA, particularly Director of the CIA, and the Director of National Intelligence across previous administrations. How much was there less tension? And I think just in how you guys get along, it's very clear you get along well, and I assume that was also the case while you were working together. But what contributed to having an effective working relationship there where it may not have been so before? And then related to that, I want people to understand the challenges in coordination for the Director of National Intelligence role, as you've described them, exacerbated by the fact that you don't directly control the overall budget, right? It sits with the different agencies, even though the Director of National Intelligence is setting out these priorities, right? There's some tension.
Well, first of all, not to embarrass John, but
Oh, let's
the reason
embarrass John.
I served with 4 directors of CIA during my time as DNI, and they were all great, but I think the high watermark was when John became CIA director, and we're close friends to start with, so that made it a lot easier. John was committed to making the DNI concept work. The law that established the DNI is flawed, a mild understatement, the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act. And a lot of the wording, the verbiage in it is deliberately ambiguous. It was made that way by the combination of the Department of Defense and the CIA, neither of whom are very interested in having a strong DNI. One of the important pillars, though, of the IRTPA is the designation of the DNI as the National Intelligence Program Manager, the programmatic, in other words, the money. And that, if used correctly and astutely, and fortunately I'll pay tribute to my great deputy, Stephanie O'Sullivan, longtime CIA officer, we could leverage that authority to, shall I say, change behavior or influence behavior. I want to pay tribute to Sean Donovan, who unknowingly signed a couple memos that greatly strengthened my role as DNI in managing things programmatically. The program of the DNI is, the NIP, as it's called, the National Intelligence Program, is spread across 6 cabinet departments. And much of it's buried in the Department of Defense, so it's programmatically a nightmare to manage. But through Sean's help, we
This is when Sean was Director of Office of Management and Budget.
I'm sorry?
Just because Sean had 2 hats, so just to
Well,
be clear,
this is when he was
Management and Budget.
O&B director.
Right.
Yeah. I don't know what his other job
HUD,
was.
exactly. Just
But anyway, the point I want to make here is, at risk of embarrassing John, is that he was crucial to this. There are all kinds of ways John could have undercut me because of the previous relationship and close relationship he had with President Obama, who relied on John extremely heavily, and rightfully so. And John and I just worked out the mechanics of how to make this work. And I never wanted to go to the sit room without John. I always wanted him there. So I had somebody else that was of like mind. So I think the personal chemistry has a lot to do with making this work. It was a difficult divorce, no question about it. I will observe that, through my previous assignments, I got to observe about 20 years worth of DCIs, Directors of Central Intelligence / Director CIA. With a couple of notable exceptions, sooner or later, the DCIs got consumed with agency-centric issues, as John alluded, which is quite understandable. I had 2 agencies for a total of 9 years, DIA and NGA, and they themselves, and those intelligence agency jobs, are all-consuming 7x24 jobs. So sometimes it was kind of like, for the DCI, part-time help at the post office at Christmas time. And it was much better, I think, and I think this is one of the attributes or virtues of the DNI, is somebody who's not encumbered with the day-to-day responsibilities of running a big agency, and who can champion integration, collaboration, coordination, whatever term you want to use, which, as I said, is not a natural bureaucratic act. But I just want to salute my friend John Brennan, because the success we enjoyed together as a team very much depended on John.
We're friends now, but he was a real pain in the ass. I believe very strongly in this concept of integration in the intelligence community. I was a real proponent of it, advocate, especially setting up the National Counterterrorism Center. So I believe that a strong DNI was a benefit not just to the CIA, but to the rest of the community. And when Jim was DNI and I was CIA director, we didn't always agree. And there were times, I remember vividly, because I had in my home In my basement, I had all my computers and whatever, and Jim had the same. But there was one time, I think I was down, in fact, at Williamsburg at our training facility down there,
Yeah.
where there was a difference of view that Jim had gotten some perspective from one of his underlings, and I got perspective from one of my underlings, and Jim was, I think, 2 martinis into the night, and I was about 2 or 3 bourbons into the night.
It was a Franken candidate thing, yeah.
It was like, going back and forth on this is like you and the horse you rode in on. And
And the horse you rode in on, yeah.
But then, we were able to have this disagreement and then be able to address it. And the next day, or even later that night, crying on each other's shoulders, sorry, I said that to you, whatever. Because that relationship between the DNI and the director of CIA, I think, is so critically important. I know I am a bit biased, but I think the CIA is the jewel in the intelligence community crown. And if they're not getting along, it really undercuts not just the work of those 2 agencies, but also the work of the community as a whole. And President Obama would not have allowed and did not allow. And one of the reasons why Jim became DNI is that the incumbents, previous individuals, and his role and my role, were not getting along well. And one of the things that, I think he said to Jim, and one of the things he said to me when I became director of CIA, make the relationship work. Now, we didn't have to make it work, because I had worked with Jim for a number of years in his previous capacity, especially in USDI. And so we, I think, respected each other's experience and perspectives, and were able to work through any of these problems that we had.
There's no saw in the Air Force. You want me around when the plane crashes, have me around when the plane takes off. And meaning, keep me informed. So the arrangement I had with all the agencies, but particularly CIA during John's time, was kind of open kimono. And that afforded a CIA another supportive voice on the Hill. So to the extent that I was fluent about what CIA was doing and its programs and activities, and I could be an advocate and a supporter of it, along with John. So that is, a Me Too chorus whenever we appeared in Congress.
Which I would say also, though, underscores the trust you had in one another of being able to honestly talk about disagreements and also know where the tension points were for representing out in the public.
About every month, we'd have a dinner. We'd do home and aways, either Odie and I at Liberty Crossing or out at Langley. It was just John and his deputy with David or Avril, and then Stephanie and me, just the 4 of us. And after a couple drinks, all the problems went away.
Well, I'll say, just to give you the kind of mirror image of what it can be like when there is tension. And I was on the National Security Council staff in an operational role in the first 4 or 5 months of President Obama's administration. And so in literally setting the table for Situation Room meetings, where there would be questions before every single meeting about whether there were going to be 2 seats, whether the CIA would be at the table along with DNI or just DNI in the room. And it was a lot of time expended on who got to be in the room, never mind kind of the information. So this is the other extreme of that.
That predated us, yes.
No, exactly. Very clearly predated.
We sat in the
both of
same
you.
seat.
But I think probably informed some of the decision making about putting the 2 of you in the roles. We have some great questions. I wanted to just spend a couple minutes with you both on re-engineering questions, because you really have throughout your careers, including in Obama administration time. Jim, you've outlined some of the work at DNI and the benefits of, I would say, being in that job for a 6-year plus tenure and your previous experience. And John, I was with you as you worked on the reorganization of reabsorbing Homeland Security Council into the National Security Council at the very beginning of the Obama administration, as well as the deep work you did on CIA. And we've referenced indirectly the standing up what became the NCPC. And so I'm curious, I think you, and I definitely got this even more from reading the transcripts of your interviews, how much you both see things kind of across the national security system in terms of how process and function inform the quality of what the intelligence community and beyond is able to do in serving a president on national security issues. What would you say you what's the kind of most important thing for you that you've gotten out of it? A lot of blood, sweat, and tears to spend time on the reorganization or reengineering side, and often without accolades from those who are affected by the reorganizing. So can either of you reflect?
Well, I'll just say, let me introduce John. The reorganization, reengineering, whatever term you want to use, that he effected at CIA was probably the most profound since it was established in 1947. I did something similar, on a lesser scale at NGA, but I'd like John to speak to the, I think, well taken reengineering of CIA.
I was a proud liberal arts graduate from Fordham University, New York. But throughout the course of my career, I served in different parts of the government. Rotation with the Department of State, worked overseas, was in staff, analytic work, operational work, served at the White House. And so I had the opportunity, the privilege, to be able to see all the different parts, which really, and then the stand-up of the National Counterterrorism Center, which was to bring in all of the authorities, capabilities, systems, networks, databases of the various elements of counterterrorism. And so I became really enamored with systems engineering and systems re-engineering, because I really believe that if you integrate capabilities, particularly in an era when you have such technological innovation and change, and most of the structures in the US government and departments and agencies were set up in the 20th century with 20th century technologies, and now there's much better opportunity to be able to connect with one another and to leverage the capabilities in a more effective way. So when I was at the White House for the first 4 years, I was the recipient of a lot of CIA's input and product. And I got frustrated because I knew CIA had tremendous breadth of capabilities, but I felt as though sometimes I was just getting soda straws because the CIA itself was not structured in a way that was really able to integrate and leverage capabilities effectively. So when I went back to CIA, when I was appointed director, I decided my job as CEO of CIA was to take the baton from my predecessor and then be able to hand it off to my successor and make sure that the agency is in a much better position to deal with the challenges of the future as opposed to the past. So I made it a point to reorganize the agency. I was always impressed by what the Department of Defense did with the Goldwater-Nichols Act in the 80s and 90s, which was to bring all the different services of the US military together in these unified combatant commands. So I did something similar within CIA, much to the dismay and anger of a lot of people who are wedded to the old system. But again, I just think if we're going to optimize capabilities more effectively, we need to be able to bring in new processes, new systems, new structures in order to, again, integrate those capabilities more effectively. And so even though some of my predecessors said they're going to change it back to the old system because they heard from the old CIA retirees, Brennan messed up the agency, it has withstood the test of time. And it's still functioning the way it is. Now, there's been some adaptations which are important to do based on the changes in the world. But again, it gets back to just throwing additional money at stuff is insufficient. And sometimes it is, in fact, counterproductive because you may want to make sure that you have a system set up that's able to absorb resources and be able to carry out its capabilities as optimally as possible.
Going into that kind of change, and Goldwater-Nichols obviously had Congress behind it, right? It was done in partnership.
Yeah.
And so who was going to have your back as you were doing this?
This guy, number one, because I kept Jim informed about what I was planning to do. And Jim was a real advocate and proponent of it. President Obama, I think by that time I had gained his trust and confidence. And he said, John, if you're willing to do that, to undertake it, I didn't want to be just on autopilot.
Yeah. I
could have cruised at CIA. Now, the Congress was a different story. I was briefing them, the oversight committees, on it, but they wanted me to do a Mother May I. And if I did a Mother May I, they'd still be debating it right now. And I told them, I said, I am CEO of this. It's my responsibility as chief executive of CIA to make sure that I optimize capabilities, because when I do hand over that baton, I want to make sure the agency is going to be able to hit the ground running. And right now, I see the flaws in it. the fact that I had served in CIA for 25 years before, and I knew all the different parts of it. I served as chief of station overseas. I had served, in senior analytic positions, PDB brief or whatever. So I think I was able to, talk to them, and a lot of them had impressions of the agency based on what they had heard from this person and that person. But again, it was the benefit I had of being able to serve in so many different capacities. It really gave me an opportunity to understand how that ecosystem evolved and how it could, in fact, be leveraged in order to make sure that our first customer, which is the President of the United States, is going to get the absolute best. Right.
Best line in Bob Gates's book, Duty, which is recounted his experience as Secretary of Defense. And Bob didn't particularly care for dealing with the Congress either. But he said, when the red light goes on top of the TV camera, it has the same impact on members of Congress as a full moon on werewolves. I always love that line.
And yet, to underscore, you both have also talked about the importance of Congress.
Absolutely.
And a partnership.
And for
with
many
it.
years, especially the Senate Intelligence Committee, would work in a bipartisan manner. It was set up after all of the problems of the Nixon and era. And in my experience, what they're supposed to do is take off of their partisan cloak and leave it outside the door, so that when they actually are dealing with intelligence and security issues, they're looking at it from the standpoint of not what's good for this party or that party, but what's good for the country. And they need to take that seriously. Unfortunately, partisan politics has not just seeped into those environments now, because in many respects it's overwhelmed it.
I'm very old. I was around in the 70s when the committees were first stood up, both
The intelligence oversight.
the Senate Select Committee for Intelligence and the House Permanent Select Committee for Intelligence. And that's exactly how they initially behaved. The members took it on as a sacred public trust, unrelated to their home state, their home district, or their party. And unfortunately, over time, that aura of nonpartisanship is profoundly eroded.
So I'm going to try to fit in several of these questions in the audience. Some we've covered in our conversation thus far. Can you talk, and this was specifically for John, the question, but I actually think, Jim, you've had experience in this as well. Talk about briefing President Obama when you had bad news to deliver, which you've pointed out is your role. I think particularly John as Homeland Security Advisor, you were there and probably discussing the Sandy Hook day, but talk about what it's like to deliver that.
I can recall a specific incident involving you, John, if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
This is, I'll say I got to be careful here, but a particular CIA operation went awry, and it resulted in some deaths. And John asked me to be there, but he, obviously wanted to brief the president on, and it was bad news. It was a mistake, a human error, and I'll never forget the forthrightness and forthright manner in which John just laid this out to the president. Not evasive about it. Here's the facts. Here's what happened. Here's what we're going to try to do to correct it. And I thought it was a phenomenal performance on John's part.
Sandy Hook shooting, I was working at the White House at the time. Early reports came in that there was this shooting up at this elementary school in Connecticut. And the initial reports were that the gunman was neutralized and everybody was okay. That was what was coming across. And I went up to the president, told him about it. And even in the PDB session then, I had one of my colleagues come in to say, well, we're still trying to figure this out, but it looks like all the children are safe. So we finished up the PDB. I went down to my office, and then I got a call from Sean Joyce, who was the deputy director of FBI. Morning, he said, "John, it's terrific. Children killed, and our FBI was just access to it." And so, as soon as I heard that, he gave me a few more details. I went up to the Oval Office, and the Oval Office door was a bit open. I spoke to the president, scheduled right outside. I said, "I need to go and see the president." The president was reading something, and he had a smile on his face, and he looked up at me. He goes, "What's up?" You could see in my face. I told him what I had heard. And it was this shocked look on his face, and my eyes really just felt as we're fathers, and provided him a few details of it. In fact, there's a photo in my book. Pete, who's the photographer, photo of briefing him on this when he just leans back on the sofas. It was the most emotional experience I had there with him. Sometimes I had to bring other reports about what had happened overseas, whatever, including the loss of life. But that morning, just two individuals who had families and were just immediately thinking about the horrific scene and the impact on the families that would never be the same. So there was such a human quality to President Obama, who was able to show such empathy, grace, character, even at the lowest of times, that I think made Jim, myself, and all the other people here who had the privilege to work for him just really respect him and say, yeah, this is what a president should be, and this is what our president is.
Thanks for sharing that with us. Let me switch tacks a little bit here. We talked earlier about how you establish priorities within the intelligence community and follow through. This question is about what intelligence the Obama administration received about so-called Arab Spring, the period in time, the tumult in the Middle East, and how the information it received, the administration received, affected the response.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, John spoke earlier of one of the functions of intelligence is to describe trends, and in fact, we used to do every 3-4. They stopped it, unfortunately, every 3-4 years a global trends publication, which was unclassified. But that's one of the functions of intelligence, I think, is to describe and portray and try to give insight into what are the trends across the Mideast or anywhere. So certainly the Intelligence Committee had done that, predicting, a fruit salesman that was going to start a conflagration in the Mideast. That's pretty tough. You're getting into this is more of a mystery than a secret sort of thing. So that's widely ascribed as a intelligence failure, I suppose. But again, the Intelligence Committee doesn't do clairvoyance. You want the Intelligence Committee to be clairvoyant, got to give them a lot more money. So I think it's a little unfair to point to that, which people like to do. That, well, we didn't know that was going to happen. That specific event, trigger event, was going to set off a conflagration in the Mideast. Certainly, the Intelligence Committee had voluminously documented the trends and forces that could impact that kind of behavior in the Mideast. John?
I think two things that I remember from that. One is that there was quite a bit of reform within CIA after that, because, as Jim pointed out, we didn't have a good sense of sentiments on the ground. Had a lot of access to both clandestine and direct to senior officials throughout, and different types of signals intelligence or espionage, whatever. But the sentiment on the ground was something that the agency,
Like not tracking social media.
social media, exactly. So as Jim pointed out, we didn't realize, or the CIA didn't realize, it was the White House at the time, just how dry the forest was. That Tunisian fruit salesman who self-immolated, that set off that fire throughout. And we realized, or the CIA realized, that they needed to have a better sense of what's going on the ground, not just in the ministries and in the office of the presidencies and others. What really are people sort of agitating about, and how ripe is it for some type of revolution of sorts? The second thing was that at that time there were a lot of people, including close around President Obama, who believed that as long as you remove those authoritarian leaders, the democracy is going to somehow flourish.
Hence Spring, Arab Spring.
And democracy, as we well know, is not like a light switch. We certainly don't have it right here yet. But over there, if you remove Mubarak, that doesn't mean that you're going to then have a, pluralistic society and that you're going to have, the rights and freedoms that you really, expect out of a democracy. And so it was really quite a, a period of time of uncertainty about, okay, what is being ushered in now, and how can you actually try to, ensure that there's going to be some progress on that democratic, human rights, freedom, liberty front, while at the same time not just creating more chaos. And unfortunately, the Arab Spring, did not really result in the type of change that we wanted. We had more strongmen that have come in. But again, it demonstrates that there is really there are significant challenges right now to having democratic societies be able to flourish, because we see a lot of backtracking across the globe, which is very worrisome from a trend perspective. But some of this is, I think, up and down, but especially in the Middle East and the Arab Spring, we have a long way to go before we actually are able to see some progress on that democratic human rights front.
So I've got a related question here, though, from a different person in the audience, as far as I know. But I think it follows. Over the administrations you both have served, how have you seen technology change in the approach to intelligence work? I mean, you mentioned the PDB not being available electronically. That's a very small piece. But how would you see those changes? And some of that, I assume, also goes to the role that open source has played and who has access in various ways to social media.
Well, I first came to the intelligence community in 1963, and I just looking back at the technological achievements, and I think one of the factors that's had the most impact on changing intelligence has been technology. When you think of our overhead system, starting with U-2 overflights of the Soviet Union, and of course they ended very dramatically, and then how we built up our, which is phenomenal, our capability today of our National Reconnaissance Office and the systems that it fields. And now we're confronted, the intelligence community is confronted with artificial intelligence, which holds huge potential for relieving analysts, particularly, of mundane things that they shouldn't have to do. But all technology has a two-edged sword, and it's absolutely crucial that we learn how to manage and regulate a powerful tool like artificial intelligence. So I think it has historically had huge impact on the intelligence community and its capabilities, and it will continue to do so.
It has profoundly affected human espionage. Years ago, I'd be able to fabricate a passport, falsify a visa, give an officer a disguise, give them a fistful of 50s, and get out and go into denied areas. Now, with machine-readable passports, iris scanners, biometric things, and also an environment where digital dust is collected by everybody, and whether you're using a credit card or just going through the CCTVs that are able to see what you're doing, it's made it much more difficult to carry out those clandestine collection capabilities on the ground. So you need to be able to find innovative, ingenious ways to be able to somehow conceal yourself in this digital dust environment. And CIA, to its credit, does that. But again, technology has transformed profoundly, fundamentally, and it's going to continue to change as a result of AI and other things that are coming, yet that will affect the intelligence community's ability to collect.
So in terms of artificial intelligence, where do you see the threats that it poses versus the opportunities it poses in the intelligence arena? I assume there are both.
Well, I'm hardly an expert on it. It's interesting. I think about it. Artificial intelligence was hardly on my radar scope when I left in 2017, and now it's it's a big deal, and it's like all other, like fire. there are great applications for fire, and if fire gets out of hand, it's very bad. And it's the same thing with artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence holds huge potential particularly for analysts who have spent so much time gathering, correlating, synthesizing data before they could do any analysis that is unique to the human brain. And artificial intelligence holds the potential for changing that, to relieve the analysts of all those mundane details and tasks, so the analyst can concentrate on what's really important, what a human mind can do uniquely. But if it's artificial intelligence can only do what it's told, humans have to tell artificial intelligence how to behave, and it can do so either constructively or destructively.
Our adversaries are using artificial intelligence to try to confuse us. So even though we use artificial intelligence to try to understand that environment, they are trying to make sure that they're able to deceive us with artificial intelligence as well. As at CIA, we experimented with machine learning and other things, but it has just taken off by leaps and bounds. The thing that worries me, thinking about the technological world, I remember well, I think it was 2009, 2010, President Obama's Secretary of the Energy, Steve Chu, who was a Nobel laureate in physics, came into my office in the White House there, spent the next 45 minutes or so scaring the bejesus out of me about quantum computing. He said, quantum computing, he goes, I don't know whether it's going to be 2, 5, 10 years from now, but we need to get ahead of it, because once quantum physics is going to be understood and be able to be managed and controlled, it's going to have the ability to really just totally penetrate the cryptography that we have relied on for so long in terms of the international financial system, internet, classified networks, top secret networks will be penetrable by those adversaries who are able to harness quantum computing in order to go in. And so right now the US government is trying to get quantum proof for post-quantum cryptography they can put in place. But also it's just going to fundamentally transform issues related to things even like satellite imagery or logistics, climate. There are so many things with quantum computing, and they're getting closer to it. There are a number of initiatives here. We're in a race with China. But this is the type of impact that technology can have that we still don't understand, both the pros and cons. Obviously, all of these things have positive application, but also there are things that really will undermine our national security and prosperity as well.
And the question of kind of what you can do about it, in which ways. And I want to ask you that in the context of you both maybe being able to use as an illustration, you both had occasion to be closely tracking how Russia was exploiting social media to kind of increase dissent in the United States, because it was in their interest to do so. How does the ability of foreign actors, not just Russia, to use our mechanisms to increase instability, how does, in the United States, how does that play out? And what are the options that government actors have to be able to deal with or address it?
That's a great question. I always thought, there's sort of two dimensions of this. I think where we're getting at here is election security. There's the cyber aspects, which are technical and you can get your arms around. So there's cybersecurity, and then what I would call cognitive security, which is much more difficult to deal with. So the Russians mounted a very, very sophisticated, aggressive, and pervasive campaign to influence public opinion in this country. And our experience, of course, of the elections of 2016, which we're still litigating. And I saw a lot of bad stuff in my 50 plus years in Intel, but nothing that got to me viscerally when I comprehended fully what the magnitude of what the Russians did in 2016. And during the Cold War, they're always pretty ham-handed about trying to influence elections, and it's pretty obvious what they were doing. Well, this is very different. A very, very sophisticated campaign. I think we're successful in suppressing the vote. I think they helped influence who to vote for. And so while we weren't aware of any manipulations of voting machines or the voting apparatus. I think certainly we were a victim of opinion manipulation in this country. Rand Corporation has a very apt phrase. We have a bad case of truth decay in this country, and the Russians fully exploited it and continue to do so, I believe.
I think it's the biggest challenge that democracies face in the future. It's not just foreign adversaries, it's domestic actors as well. It's influence operations. It's taking advantage of this digital environment where most human activity, communication takes place, to push out misinformation, which is putting out false information unknowingly, but then pushing out disinformation, pushing out false information intentionally. And we see, whether you're domestic actors or whether you're foreign adversaries, whatever else, taking full advantage of that environment, but also taking advantage of this country's hallmark, which is prizing freedom of speech and the freedoms and liberties that go along with a democratic country, republic like ours. And so those malactors that are out there, many of them, will do whatever they can in order to achieve and pursue their agendas. And whether it's the Russians, the Chinese, or other foreign actors, and a lot of them, are trying to influence popular opinion so that it affects one's cognitive abilities at the voting booth, as well as just to mislead, malign, denigrate others. And Jim and I have, professional and personal experiences in this regard. But how does a government work in order to prevent that type of exploitation when putting out false information is not illegal? Again, it's one of the features of this country of ours that you have the freedom to speak. But I just find it just so appalling and unconscionable when people who know better, people who are in positions of authority and responsibility, push out false information as a way to achieve personal political agendas. I don't know how we deal with that. I don't know how we mitigate the effects of that without some type of common understanding about what is right, what is principled, what is ethical. But unfortunately, a lot of those traits are no longer, pervasive in certain circles.
But in pulling the common understanding thread, we're sitting at a university. Do you think that universities have a role in kind of educating in awareness, because they are now the generation of undergraduates have existed in a digital space where agreement on facts may be harder to attain?
I don't know if a university, perhaps that's the place for it. I do believe it has to be something unrelated to the government, because the government, whether right or left, is going to be viewed with suspicion. This may be a great opportunity for application of artificial intelligence, tailored for determining to the maximum extent possible what are the facts. And if somehow, this is the magic thing and everything works, some sort of independent, not-for-profit, not related to the government organization that could bring together articulate voices from the right and left and agree on some artificial intelligence standards that you could look to, sort of a NIST kind of arrangement, that could be viewed objectively as, well, based on this program, blessed by right and left, this would help generate or point to what's actual fact as opposed to all the mis and disinformation.
Yeah, I'm not as old as Jim, but I'm old enough to remember the good housekeeping seal of approval, which is exactly what Jim is talking about, which is there some way that could be an independent entity that would be able to evaluate, including, for elections. This candidate says this candidate says that, but let's tell you what the truth is, irrespective of whether you're not, on the left or the right. And we need something like that. So, I think universities, other places can be thinking innovatively about how we can take away some of this responsibility for the government, because as Jim says, the way Congress is right now, the way the political, environment is, it's not conducive to coming up with something that doesn't benefit one side or the other. there really needs to be some type of independent, objective way in order for the American public, whether or not you're, Joe Voter in Iowa or, someone in California, to be able to look at it and have a true prism through which to look at the claims and understand what the truth is.
Thank you. Listen, I want to, our time here has come to an end. I'm going to apologize to those whose questions we didn't get to. I hope everyone agrees with me. We've had a very rich conversation. And for those of you who continue to have questions, and even if you don't, I highly recommend you read the interviews that Jim Clapper and John Brennan did, and also you go back and read their memoirs, which will give you a deeper and richer understanding as well, and hopefully address any questions that we didn't get to. And I just want to say there's a reason John Brennan's book is entitled Undaunted, and I think everyone here can agree with me on that, and really to thank them both for being here today, but for their years of dedication to public service in a very challenging time.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you.
Welcome back. Oh, can you hear me? Good. Great. Well, thank you everybody for returning. I hope you all enjoyed the panel this morning and that you're looking forward to our second session. My name is Dr. Elizabeth Rees. I'm one of the research fellows here at the Miller Center, working with Barbara and Russell on the oral history program. And I'm delighted to just kick us off with the scroller ahead of our second panel on policymaking during economic crisis and its aftermath. So I had the great pleasure of helping Barbara go through all of the transcripts of this project as we were getting ready to roll this out. I think we started in November, December time, reading through all of the transcripts, trying to find interesting quotes and clips that we could use for scrollers, not only for this event, but also for our website. If you head to the listening to the presidency section of the website, you can go there and look at these scrollers and read the transcripts, which I obviously would encourage you all to go and do. And this was one of the scrollers that I picked out. It really jumped out to me as someone who kind of grew up in the era of the economic crisis and feeling like that was very scary. And obviously we heard a bit about what that was like from Sean Donovan in last night's panel. And so this scroller is Cecilia Munoz, who came in 2009 as the director of the White House Office of Intergovernmental Affairs, before going on to be on the Domestic Policy Council after Melody Barnes, if I'm correct. And in this scroller, Cecilia is just remembering how absolutely terrifying this prospect was when coming into the Obama administration.
Let me ask one explicit question that's been about something that's at least beneath the surface throughout this time, and you've already addressed it, is the financial crisis. To what extent is that dominating?
Oh my gosh. It's impossible to overstate how much it was dominating, right? Because we're in it's a free fall that's happening in real time. We're in the middle of it, and we don't know where the bottom is, right? So it's like with every passing day, the scale of it gets more apparent, and the economists that are running around the transition building are getting wider and wider eyed. So it is kind of the beginning and ending of every sentence and every meeting is that we're about to be responsible for the United States government in a moment of free fall. We don't know where the bottom is. This is possibly the Great Depression again. Now go figure out what to do. Utterly terrifying. And it's not reassuring to realize how utterly terrified Larry Summers is and Jason Furman is. And, the economists who are kind of supposed to know the answers are like, whoa, like that was a big number that just went by. So that's what it feels like. It was, and it's clear that nothing else can happen. None of the president's ambitions can be realized unless we right the ship. What was not clear was where the bottom was, or that the Republicans were going to be such an obstacle, like that to addressing the crisis.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Chris Liu. I had the privilege of serving as White House Cabinet Secretary during the first term of the Obama administration, and I'm a Schlesinger Distinguished Professor here at the University of Miller Center. We had a fascinating conversation this morning about policy making during national security, and we're now going to focus to domestic policy and talk about the economic crisis, the aftermath, the president's domestic policy agenda. And as with all the things that we do here, what makes our work so unique is that we're going to hear from the people who are actually in the room. I will say that I gave them a list of questions in advance, and I'm going to completely deviate from that. Because I think the conversations we've had over the last day, I think, show that a more informal, candid assessment of what worked well and what didn't work well, I think would be most interesting in this moment. So let me start by introducing the panelists. To my left is Melody Barnes, my colleague here. She's a professor of practice here at the Miller Center. She's also the executive director of the Karsh Institute for Democracy here at the University of Virginia. She also served as the head of the Domestic Policy Council during the first term of the Obama administration. Next over is Ray LaHood, who served as Secretary of Transportation during the first term of the Obama administration. Previous to that, he was a longtime Republican congressman from Illinois, and we're going to get into that a little bit. And then Sally Jewell, who served as Secretary of the Interior during the second term of the Obama administration, and prior to that had served as CEO of REI, the outdoor company. I do want to get to the financial crisis, but I think we started last night's conversation with a very eloquent remembrance from Melody about what Election Day was like in 2008. And so I do want to talk a little bit more about that, but let me first turn to you, Ray. You came in with a very unique perspective on the president and the chief of staff. You were a fellow congressman with Rahm Emanuel. You had served in Congress with Barack Obama. Talk to me, and you had actually were announcing your retirement from Congress before you got called in. Talk about your relationship with Obama and Rahm Emanuel before coming in, and your decision to serve in the cabinet as a Republican member.
Let me start by saying thank you to the Miller Center. This is an extraordinary organization to capture the essence of the presidency. Gerald Ford is monumental, and it's so important. And Barbara, thank you for the opportunity to sit with you and do our oral presentation. Obviously very professional. I'm honored to have been a part of this, so thank you for the way it was all handled. And thank you to all of you that are here today interested in the Obama administration, and I'm sure you're all very interested in our country, and thank you all for being good citizens and showing up here this morning. I served in Congress for 14 years, but I was a congressional staffer for 17 and a half years. And I had the unique opportunity to be chief of staff for the longest serving Republican leader, Bob Michael, who hailed from Peoria, Illinois. An extraordinary leader, served with, I think, 9 different presidents, and was the lead for Ronald Reagan when he became president to help get his legislative agenda through a Democratic Congress. Very good friends with Tip O'Neill when Tip was Speaker. And I come from a district that was once represented by Abraham Lincoln, represented 9 counties of the 20 that I represented, only for 1 term in the U.S. House. I represented the same district as Everett Dirksen, same district as Bob Michael, and I'm very proud of the fact that my son Darren succeeded me in Congress. We have a long, rich history in central Illinois of bipartisanship. Lyndon Johnson admits that he could not have passed the Civil Rights Bill without Everett Dirksen, a conservative Republican from Pekin, Illinois, which is a community of about 15,000 people. Bob Michael, longest-serving Republican leader, helped Ronald Reagan push through his agenda, helped George Herbert Walker Bush get through a very, very tough time. And and really became good friends with Bill Clinton while in the last 2 years of being Republican leader. And so I'm proud of the area that I come from. And I also have written a book that I encourage you to take a look at. Not because all the proceeds go to the Dirksen Congressional Center in Pekin, Illinois, but it's about bipartisanship and how we were able to make it work back in the time that we served. Which leads me to answer Chris's question, which probably all of you forgot already. But Ram and I became friends. He from Chicago, a Jewish member from Chicago, a Democrat, Ray LaHood from Central Illinois. My grandparents came from Lebanon in 1895 and settled in Peoria, Illinois. Ram and I became friends because we wanted to do good things for Illinois. And I was in a position to help him, and he was in a position to help me. He was in leadership, and I was on some committees that could be helpful to Chicago. And we would host dinners at the Monaco, which is a restaurant on the Senate side. I would invite 7 or 8 Republicans. He invited 7 or 8 Democrats, and different each time. And once a quarter, we would do these dinners, and he and I became very, very good friends. I cherish that friendship today. And in 2008, I was a delegate to the Republican convention supporting John McCain, who was a very good friend of mine. I love John McCain. He was an extraordinary senator. And when he decided to run for president, I jumped on his bandwagon. I became a delegate, went to Minneapolis, went to the convention. And I had never met then State Senator Obama when he was running for the United States Senate. And I never met him personally until after he was elected United States Senator. My cell phone rings. I'm in Peoria in my congressional office. Ray, this is Barack Obama. I say, congratulations, he's just been elected to the Senate. I'm coming to Peoria, which is my hometown, 140 miles from Chicago. I want to sit down and talk to you. He came to my congressional office. We met for 90 minutes. This is prior to him being sworn in as a senator. And we talked about how we were going to work for Illinois. He opened, after he was sworn in, opened an office in Springfield, Illinois, which was in my district. I went to the opening of that office, and I think people were shocked to see me there. We became good friends during that 2-year period that he served as senator, and we worked together for Illinois. And it was clear he was on a path, obviously, for bigger and better things. And I announced in early that I was not going to run for re-election after 14 years. And I saw him during the campaign, and he said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I have no idea." And he said, "Look, if this thing works out for me, I may be looking for a Republican." I said, "I hope you'll call me." A few days after the election, Ram and I spoke. I said, "Are you serious about the idea of having a Republican?" The president was serious about it. A week later, on a very cold day, in December, I traveled to Chicago and met with President-elect Obama. I had no idea when I went to this meeting whether there'd be 40 people in the room. President-elect Obama greeted me with a hug, as he is accustomed to doing. We talked for 40 minutes. That was it. He and I, in a room, 40 minutes. I left. I had no idea. And a few days later, Ram called and said he would like you to be Secretary of Transportation. I did not think about it for more than 1 second. This was an opportunity of a lifetime, similar to what Sean was talking about. And I have served with a number of presidents, but to serve with the most historic president in the history of our country, a friend of mine, knowing that Rahm Emanuel was going to be his chief of staff. And what I've told people is, when you are in the cabinet, you have to have a friend in the White House. You simply do. and it can't be the president. It's got because you cannot pick up the phone and call the president. You just can't, for all the reasons that have, because he's too busy. And I had a friend in Rahm Emanuel. And almost all of my success, for whatever success I had, was because the people that I surrounded myself with, including my former chief of staff who's here with me today, and my friendship with Rahm, led to whatever success we had at DOT. Now, I know there are people, including Chris, that maybe don't particularly like Rahm.
We're going to get to that in a second, actually.
I love President Obama and I love Rahm Emanuel. And whatever success I had at DOT was because of the friendship that I had with both of them.
Thank you. Before we circle back to the financial crisis, Sally, let me turn to you. So 4 years later, you're the CEO of REI. You have not served in government. How do you end up in the Obama cabinet?
Good question. A nice woman like you end up in a place like that.
And did you know what you're getting yourself into?
Well, I had worked with Dirk Kempthorne, who was George W. Bush's second Secretary of the Interior, mainly because, part of the portfolio of Interior is the National Park Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service. A lot of what my customers cared about was public lands. And so I had been making the case for the economic benefit of public lands to anybody that would listen. And that included Secretary Kempthorne. So he's the first person I had met that was in that role. And I got to say, the role was not on my radar in any way. I got on the radar. Well, I actually learned that I was potentially a candidate by reading a gossip column in one of the newspapers in Seattle, the Post-Intelligencer, which by that time had gone digital. And people are calling and freaking out at REI. What's this about? And I said, there's no truth to that. I have no idea where that came from. No, I'm running REI. It's fine. And then I do get a call from Michael Froman, actually, who I think was leading part of that effort. And it was December 21st, 2012, exactly 1 week after the Newtown massacre. And like Ray's experience, I didn't know who I was going to be meeting with or what I was going to be doing. And I have a solo meeting with President Obama in the White House. And this was also, so December 21st, families all in Hawaii waiting for him. He's dealing with the fiscal cliff, right? And no budget and, kind of being forced through that holiday season. And he just exactly 1 week earlier had the worst day of his presidency, which probably is still true. I think if you would ask him, was that Newtown situation that John Brennan so eloquently explained to us. And so how did I get on the radar? I had no idea. And then two of my mentors fessed up. They were Bill Ruckelshaus, Republican from Indiana, Attorney General, but he had finished his career in the Seattle area, and we had volunteered together after 9/11 on something called the Initiative for Global Development. And then his good pal, Jerry Grinstein, who had served with me or was serving with me on the Board of Regents at the University of Washington. And he was the chief of staff to Warren Magnuson, a powerful senator from my state years ago. And the two of them teamed up to raise money for President Obama. And so people asked them, I'm not sure who, well, who do you think might be good for the cabinet? And they took a 5-year-old resume and submitted it and told me nothing about it. So I learned about it when Jerry fessed up. And that's how I got on the radar. And I didn't know if I was on a list of 100. I didn't know what it meant. But I said I would be delighted to serve this president. And so it turned out, because of the release of the Clinton emails after the hack of the system, that there were two of us actually going back to 2008. Ken Salazar and me were kind of on a list, but I had no idea. And that was a Podesta email that was in the list. So I guess I'd been on the radar for a while, but I didn't know.
I also would point, I went back and looked, you got confirmed 87-11, which just doesn't happen anymore. So that's a testament to you. Let me now backtrack again and get into policy. So going back to you, Melody, I mean, Cecilia's recollections are my recollections. Talk about what that moment, what those moments were like during transition and then after Inauguration Day as we really were facing the cliff, and how that changed our priorities at the White House.
So, well, actually backing up a little bit to the,
Yeah.
and I spent half of my time working on setting up a position, half of the time campaigning around the country. So I was in Montana and Colorado and North Carolina and Pennsylvania and Virginia. And as we were going through the summer, you just started to watch the economy start to swirl closer and closer to the drain. And we're encountering people and they're telling us their stories, including, for example, students who were applying for student loans and they weren't able to get loans. I mean, the markets were just starting to really seize up. And by the time the election took place, I mean, we discussed this last night, there had been the suspension of the campaign discussion and all of these things that were focusing our attention on the fact that we had not the normal crisis in front of us. So election day comes, transition begins. I was tapped to be domestic policy advisor within the first couple of weeks of that. And the president pretty quickly, he first put together his economic team. And then he had his full panoply of senior advisors. And we had a transition meeting in DC, but then we had a transition meeting in Chicago. And it was December. And I remember we flew to Chicago and we sat down, and the purpose of the meeting was to discuss economic crisis. And Christy Romer, who was chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, was leading this particular. Christy's background, her scholarship, was the Great Depression. She starts the meeting and she looks at President-elect Obama and she said, "Mr. President, this is your oh shit moment." So that's the way the briefing begins. And to the point that Cecilia made in that video, she's laying out what the circumstances are, and with Larry in the room, Larry Summers, who was head of the National Economic Council, they're starting to talk about what our options are. And as our good friend Mona Sutphin, Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy, said, by the time problems get to us, there were no good solutions. And so we were dealing with bad and worse. And how could we put a package together to address this? And working very closely with the Bush administration, as last night described, beyond amazing, beyond helpful to us. It was a real partnership. We started to come up with solutions. But mind you, as we're doing this, we're still in transition. So we are trying to put together an economic package, and simultaneously, all of us are trying to put together our offices and our staff. So I'm meeting and interviewing people in coffee shops and trying to come up with staff, and also having been given very good advice. You've got to deal with crisis, but you also have to determine what it is that you're trying to achieve simultaneously. When this is all said and done, what policies, what objectives of the president will you have achieved by the time his administration is over? And so we take that idea both into the construction of the Recovery Act, how to get resources out, how to stabilize the economy, and how do we use this crisis moment to try and achieve other objectives simultaneously. So education reform, now the list goes on. We were looking at, high-speed rail. We were looking at all kinds of different things that the president wanted to achieve. What could we put inside this package? What number could we get to that could pass Congress? And again, I think I can't remember if you or Sean or Tom making this point last night, people were talking about big, big numbers and saying, why couldn't you have gone bigger? It's because we didn't have the vote. Politics and policy is often a game of math. If you either have the votes or you don't. So we were trying to come up with the largest package we could. We were trying to stabilize the economy, and simultaneously, we were trying to move some things forward that the president had said he wanted to achieve during the campaign, and do that without creating long tails for things that we didn't know if we would be able to fund once the Recovery Act resources ran out. So it was a combination of trying to achieve all of those things at the same time while we were still in the transition, and being able to move as seamlessly as possible to the point past the inauguration where we could then go into hyperdrive and move those objectives.
You know, I think people forget the magnitude of the Great Recession. I mean, right now, at a time when a lot of people are feeling economic distress, the unemployment rate, I think, is like 4.4%. We hit 10% by the end of 2009. I mean, even by election day of 2012, it was still 7.7%. So, Melody, we talked a little bit about the package. We did not want to go above $1 trillion, so we ended up at about $800 billion. In hindsight, I would say we probably should have gone bigger. So that was the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. Ray, a big chunk of that was money that was coming through the Department of Transportation for quote-unquote shovel-ready projects. Your charge was to get the money out the door as fast as possible with no waste, fraud, and abuse.
Yeah.
How'd you pull that one off?
Phrase.
Well, President Obama asked Vice President Biden to become sort of the leader in coordinating all of the activities around the economic stimulus, and we would have weekly meetings where he would convene the meeting and all the cabinet members would be there and talk about what they were doing to get the money out the door. We were trying to assemble our staff. We had 100 political appointees that we wanted to put in place, and our staff was interviewing those, and we were bringing people on to help us get transit money out the door, to help us really road projects, bridge projects. And one of the advantages of being a former member of Congress, I had relationships with about every member of Congress on both sides of the aisle, and they were good relationships. And we listened to them and paid attention to them in terms of what they wanted to get done in their own districts, whether it was a road, a bridge, a transit, and we relied on mayors and governors and planners and people who had been dreaming about getting these projects done. And the truth is, many of them were ready to go. All they really needed was the money to make them happen. And for all of the criticism about shovel-ready, not shovel-ready, a lot of money went out the door. We had $48 billion. What a blessing. And we had 2 years to spend it. $28 billion of it was for roads and bridges. About $8 billion was for transit. Another $8 billion to start a high-speed rail program, which had never been done in the history of the country. And that was really President Obama's vision. When he was a state senator, he would take the Amtrak train from Chicago to Springfield, Illinois, and back rather than driving. And he knew the value of developing a good, comprehensive high-speed rail system. So for whatever criticism there was, I think Vice President Biden held our feet to the fire to make sure the money was being spent correctly. We put good staff in place. We got a lot of money out the door that helped a lot of transit systems, that helped governors build roads, that helped mayors create livable and sustainable communities with our partnership with Sean and the EPA director, and we made a difference, and it was a significant difference. $48 billion is real money. And if you're a governor or a mayor or a planner and you have this opportunity, we created a Tiger program which provided money to communities where there was no money available at the federal level or no money like walking and biking paths. We created bike share programs in communities that didn't have, thanks to people like John Hickenlooper, who was the mayor of Denver, thanks to the mayor of Washington, D.C. When Ron became mayor of Chicago, one of the first things he wanted to do was fix up and build walkways and pathways along the Chicago River. Some extraordinary things were done. We spent the money wisely. Never really a bad story about our $48 billion being misspent or misappropriated or in the wrong hands of people, and we did a lot of good.
Ray, I want to ask you about the politics around recovery. And I think there was a frustration among us in the White House, and I'm sure you felt it as well, among your former Republican colleagues who had voted against the legislation, but were happily taking credit for the money going into their districts.
Yeah, look at that. As a former member of Congress for 14 years, that didn't bother me one bit. To be honest, and I don't think it really bothered President Obama. I mean, he was a senator. He knew how these things work. That's the way things work. Just because you don't vote for a bill doesn't mean you can't take credit for the money when it comes to your district. You know how these politicians are. And so I never really got irritated about that. I know some people did, but I really didn't. And because the money was going out into the country, into communities that needed this to really sustain their infrastructure.
Sally, I want to turn to you because you came in at a different period of time. I mean, obviously, the economic recovery took a very long time. It really was the dominant issue we dealt with in the first term. By the time you get to the second term, at Interior, there's still the tail end of money coming through the process, but it's almost as if we can now work on other things. Obviously, conservation, climate change, preservation issues become more prominent in the second term than they could have been in the first term. Talk about what that dynamic was like. And, I don't know if Ken Salazar gave you any warnings on the way out the door about what you could and could not accomplish.
It's a big question. I want to start by saying, as a person running a company during the Great Recession, I just want to echo how terrifying that was to be out in the community thinking that the company's going off the cliff. And I laid off over 800 people in February of 2009. And it was very, very serious. So I just want to express appreciation for the Obama administration in the first term for what they were dealing with. And Cecilia Munoz told me once what it was like. I think it was like the first day on the job when they got a question about making a disaster declaration and supporting a state, and they said, yes, of course, we'll work on that. And then they had no idea where to go or who to turn to. I'm sure that you know all about that. At any rate, it was a difficult time, and it would have been so much worse if the Obama administration had not taken the decisive action that it took. Patty Murray is one of our 2 senators in the state. She was instrumental in, I think, working with your team, getting ERA money for Washington State and Shovel Ready Project. The National Park Service was the beneficiary of some of the money to fix up roads. We'd had a major flood in Mount Rainier and taken out major roads. Anyway, it was critically important. So it's a lot easier to run a business than it is to run a government entity. And I learned that very quickly. In a business, you know your scorecard every day. Did I do well or not? You are really rewarded for taking risks. Not so true in government. You have a budget that you start with maybe a long-term plan 25 years in the future and bring it back to a 5-year strategic plan, and then the first year of that 5-year strategic plan is your plan. And I learned really quickly that that's not true in government, and that your board of directors is actually over 500 people that make decisions on what you get. So it was a very, very different environment. There were some hangovers from the first term. Superstorm Sandy had hit, devastating a lot of public lands, but a lot of the public lands along the eastern seaboard had actually protected communities inland. And so it was a really good illustration of green infrastructure and how important that is to making our landscapes and the communities behind them more resilient. Think about sort of the Rockaway area in New York City being a problem, and then you look at how much like Jamaica Bay absorbed, just to use New York examples because I'm on this coast. And that's where the storm was. It was a time of creativity. It was a time when the money that was allocated by Congress, there's $800 million or so of the Sandy relief money that came to the Department of the Interior. Took $150 million of that and said, we're going to set this aside. We're going to have it administered by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, NIFWIF is its initials, to say this money will go to communities that work together in concert with the federal agency to make their landscapes more resilient to climate change in the future. We had some wonderful examples in New Jersey, close to Cape May, where they could see the benefit of wildlife refuges and they could see the impact when they didn't have protections. And they cared deeply, regardless of politics, about the species like the crabs. the name of the crabs in the East, what is it? That unusual.
The horseshoe crabs?
Sorry, horseshoe crabs, thank you. Brain freeze. And all the sand was scoured from the beach, so the people rebuilt the beach because they knew the horseshoe crabs were going to be laying their eggs, which was critical to woodpeckers and other species that rely on that whole ecosystem. And by giving a grant to that community, we helped repair the refuge, but we also helped the community be more resilient. I will say that one thing that, being a naive non-government person coming in, is one of the reasons I was excited about taking this job was dealing with climate change. There's only so much you can do as a business person. I could see it everywhere I looked. It was on the landscapes that my business depended on, but more importantly, on the landscapes that we all depend on and take for granted. And so in one of my first talks to all of Interior, which was sort of simulcast, and we have 70,000 employees, I'm sure they all did not tune in. But I said something that came back to bite me quickly with the White House. So this was early in my tenure in the spring of 2013. And I said, as I go out on the landscapes of Interior and I see the lands and waters that are under our stewardship as public servants, you cannot deny that climate change is going on. It is everywhere I look. And so the Drudge Report came out with a Jewel creates hostile environment for climate deniers in the Department of the Interior. So I got a few conversations with the White House about that. And I said, but I thought this president really cared about climate change. That the whole administration was experiencing PTSD from the campaign. And I don't think President Obama uttered the word climate in his second campaign to be reelected, which, he was uncertain whether he'd get there or not. So that hung over until June of 2013 when he gave his climate action speech. And then the whole thing turned, and all of a sudden we had a very different environment and we could talk about it. But it gave me a good view as a non-political type who's now has such a deep appreciation both for public servants as well as lawyers. I didn't have before. Anyway, it was a time of transformation and also a time when I think the whole Obama administration kind of heaved a sigh of relief and said, I don't have to get reelected. Now let's do what I really want to do.
Yeah. I want to remind folks in the room that there are note cards and pencils. If you want to write a question, please, Alfred can bring them up to me. And if you are online, you can put them into the chat function and we'll bring them up here as well. All right, so Ray, Sally, you cabinet members, you've both talked about the White House. Melody and I were in the White House. Let's get into it. Let's talk about the White House cabinet dynamics. Very famously, Robert Reich, when he was Secretary of Labor, wrote a book called Locked in the Cabinet, and there's been this constant push and pull and struggle with White House command and control, with agencies going rogue, with whatever it is. Melody, as the head of the Domestic Policy Council, how did you approach the relationship between the White House and the cabinet? How did you try to improve that relationship? And obviously, you were aware of those inherent tensions.
I'd forgotten about the title of the book. Yes. Well, it absolutely existed, and I believe that, as Sally was saying, when you are in the White House, and I mean the executive branch in this context, the scrutiny is constant, and there are people in no matter Republican, Democratic White House, people looking for ways that they can identify your failures. They're looking for your soft underbelly. And as a result, it causes White Houses, and I'm thinking of some of our colleagues in particular, to hunker down. And I think the idea is if you can control, the more you can control, the better off you are in trying to prevent those challenges from occurring. And even though you've got a brilliant group of people that you have put together, the smaller the group, the tighter the control, the less frequent the mistakes may be. I think that is the mentality. I had a different approach to this, and I think and believe, look at Sean, and I think of other colleagues, if Kathleen Sebelius was here, if Arnie Duncan was here, and other colleagues, one, that most of what is happening in the executive branch is happening in agencies and departments. That's where you've got career civil servants who are experienced, they're deeply knowledgeable, and I remember we talk about the economic crisis, walking in, and I remember literally being giddy when I realized all that I could get from OMB. I mean, and people who could say, yeah, we did it that way before, that didn't work, but you could try it this way. So you've got all of that expertise sitting in the departments and agencies, and you've also got people who have a long memory sitting there. So one, there's that recognition. All the work that's happening there. What I saw my job as being, one, was ensuring that the president's top priorities were identified, that they were well communicated, that I was in conversation with cabinet secretaries and the undersecretaries, so that we all had a clear understanding of that, and that we understood how we were going to get to success, which meant that the lines of communication were clear, and it meant, and we discussed this a little bit, or you did last night, there were no surprises. I did not want to see it on the front page of the Washington Post before I knew about it. And there's also the recognition that people are human, so there are going to be mistakes. And I felt that if I established a strong relationship with colleagues in the cabinet, that people were more likely to call me and say, you're not going to believe this one, but. And that's ultimately what happened. And as a result, we had these very strong relationships that allowed for back and forth, for robust discussion of ideas. Some members of the cabinet who said, I'm not, policy, yes, I am not a political person, I really need help with this. So a back and forth that ultimately allowed us to come up with better solutions and fewer surprises. And when those problems emerged, we were able to try and resolve them before they exploded into something that was much more significant. You know, my colleagues and friends in the cabinet can tell you whether or not they believe that to be true. But I feel like that's the relationship that we had, and pretending as though everything was going to operate from inside 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue was a myth, fiction. It wasn't going to happen that way, and we weren't going to ultimately.
Okay, Ray, what was it like from the other side when you're getting edicts from the White House? You can do this, you can't do this. We used to always say the White House can't order you to do anything. It's always who in the White House is ordering you. Is it somebody like Melody, or is it some 25-year-old press assistant? Often it is a 25-year-old press assistant. And yet all the important work is really coming out of the agency, and yet there's not always the appreciation within the White House how important it is.
Can I just say one thing before you say that? I do remember sitting in a cabinet meeting, Secretary Gates said, if someone's calling me, they need to be an assistant. Meaning the most senior people in the White House. He did
Yeah.
want to hear from
Yeah.
the press secretary, the junior press person.
I remember Secretary Gates saying that when someone would say, there's a call from the White House, his first question, who is it? Rather than allowing for someone to use that statement as a way to get to the secretary. So we knew clearly what President Obama's vision was when it came to transportation, because it was clearly spelled out in the economic stimulus money that we received, because we knew that he had signed off on the idea that he wanted to start a high-speed rail program in America, that he wanted to help mayors and governors get projects funded because he knew that was a way to put people to work, that he wanted the kind of cooperation between the EPA and DOT on CAFE standards, EPA and HUD, and DOT on livable and sustainable communities. He knew that all of that was going to endear him to people in the country, like mayors, like governors, like planners, the dreamers out there who were trying to do things in the communities that they represented. And so we just felt like as long as we were in sync with what we were being provided in terms of resources, and we were traveling the country. I visited all 50 states at the end of my 4.5 years, 225 cities. I had relationships with many, many mayors, every governor, lots of members of Congress on both sides of the aisle. And I think President Obama was hearing all of that when he would talk to members of Congress or governors or mayors. And I think the White House seemed very satisfied with the fact that we were carrying out his agenda when it came to transportation, infrastructure, the CAFE standards, and the issues that he really cared about. One other advantage that I had that I'll mention is quite often, about every weekend that the president was in Washington, he would play golf. And there were a few of us that he knew were golfers. And so I had the advantage. I played a lot of golf with President Obama at Andrews Air Force Base. And that was an extraordinary opportunity for him to leave at the White House all of these problems that he was dealing with and concentrate on his golf game. And again, really enabled someone like me and a few other cabinet people to really continue our friendship that we had developed before we came together in Washington.
Ray, you had another advantage. I've seen an interview where you said you would regularly tell Rahm Emanuel to go to hell. I don't think many other cabinet members did that. So you had the ability to push back on the White House.
I had the ability to use the friendships that I had to be candid with.
Ray, you should go into PR. That was good.
So, Sally, by the time we got to the second term, the dynamics had changed a little bit, and they had changed in part because we shifted chiefs of staff. We went from Rahm to Pete Rouse for a second, and then we went to Jack Lew, and then Dennis McDonough, who had a much different way of managing than Rahm did. Oh, Bill Daley. I'm sorry, Bill. Thank you. To Dennis. We had also lost control of Congress, and the president and we had also gotten reelected. So the president very famously said, "Look, I can't get legislation passed, and I'm looking at one of the questions, but I have a phone and a pen." And he really unleashed the agencies in that second term. And I was going back and looking at the declarations that he made under the Antiquities Act. The overwhelming number of them happened during your period of time instead of the first term. But had you heard stories about what the first term was like, and were you a little bit relieved that there was more running room the second term?
Well, short answer to the last question, yes. I think it would have been incredibly difficult for me to come in with no government background into first term. because my naivete about how the system worked would have been problematic. And there were amazing colleagues like those in the room here who helped me understand that. I think also as a business person, one of the advantages I had, and this became really evident in my confirmation hearing, is that people knew about the REI thing, that I was running REI, but they didn't realize I'd spent 19 years as a banker, and I'd banked farmers and ranchers and feedlots and timber companies and oil and gas companies. They did know that I began my career as a petroleum engineer. And so what that did in the Senate confirmation process was enable me very quickly with people from both sides of the aisle to find common ground, because I could speak the language for the most part of the economic engines that they relied upon. And so I found allies on both sides of the aisle. And that, I think, was very helpful. President Obama ultimately protected 29 projects as national monuments. It's a large number. It was the largest amount of acreage ever protected, largely because he took George W. Bush's 2 major protections in marine protected areas in the Pacific and went from the 50 miles from the islands out to the EEZ, the 200-mile limit. So I'll just put that out there. Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument in Hawaii, and then the Pacific Remote Islands Marine National Monument. So those were started by George W. and something actually that Dirk Kempthorne, when he was secretary, was very proud of. So these are difficult jobs. There was a lot of groundwork that was done. So Ken Salazar, who I know is very close with Ray and a wonderful human being, did a lot of the groundwork. So I may have got it across the finish line, but these are things that take a long time. Some started in the Bush years, some later. A lot of the things that we protected were really important in telling the story of all America. John Jarvis, who was director of the National Park Service, came to me and said, you know, we do these theme studies that identify, and they're done by outsiders with a particular expertise in different parts of our very diverse country in identifying places that help tell the story of our country. And so he said the one that was undergoing at the time I got in, and that was the first term, was summer homes of obviously wealthy people who have summer homes. And he said, why are we doing this? And he changed it around and launched theme studies for African American community, Asian American Pacific Islander, LGBTQ community, and so on. And a lot of the monuments, like Stonewall National Monument in New York City, came out of this is a place where something historic happened that needs to be protected to tell that story. And we did a number of other ones. The Honolulu National Monument in Hawaii, which was recognizing an internment camp that had basically been lost to history because of the embarrassment of the selective internment of Japanese in World War II, because 50% of the population, roughly, was Japanese, or a large portion of the Hawaii population. So President Obama's protection was very broad, and it was celebrating the diversity of this country and the stories, painful and proud, of Americans across the country. So there are some large ones like the ones in the Pacific. There was controversial ones like Bears Ears National Monument, which we worked very hard with members of Congress, including the Utah delegation, on what they called the Public Lands Initiative to try and do this congressionally, and they seemed very committed. And I heard from the outdoor industry people, hey, these guys are committed, we're making this happen. Rob Bishop pulled a fast one on us at the end because he wanted to say that the president declared a midnight monument at the end of the term. It couldn't be farther from the truth. They convinced President Trump to undo that. President Biden redid it, 2 of them, Bears Ears National Monument, Grand Staircase Escalante. So politics involved, but there was no dispute that these areas, which had been researched going back before my term were places that the Antiquities Act was designed to protect. Places that are really important in our history that, if developed, and there were threats in both cases, or all of these cases to development, the president could act and did. So really important part, I think, of President Obama's legacy, but with a lot of hard work done by people that got there long before I got there, and career staff that deeply knew these landscapes and these places. And in the case of Bears Ears, a coalition of 5 Native American communities, tribes, and pueblos who banded together. Sometimes they don't get along. They all got along for this, saying there's over 100,000 sites in this area, and if we don't protect it, it's already being overrun. Petroglyphs being shot up, oil and gas development, mining, etc. So very, very proud of what President Obama did. But also, to your question about the White House, the president is getting all kinds of incoming, including from people on the outside that have been supporters, and very strident environmental groups. And I found President Obama to be, and it's been said in all of the sessions up here, so well prepared, such a good listener. When he came to me with questions prepared by his team at the White House that I could tell were originating from groups on the outside that were putting pressure, if I had my facts straight, there was never one time when President Obama didn't take. He really listened, and he had lots of voices trying to influence him. And I generally found the people in the White House very helpful to work with. And also, my interior is full of conflict, laws that conflict with one another, Fish and Wildlife Service protecting endangered species, the Bureau of Land Management leasing land for oil and gas and mining and grazing and other things. Those also happen between agencies, as I'm trying to protect fish, and Gina McCarthy's trying to do her power plant negotiations on the climate thing, and I found Dennis McDonough to be a great mediator as we work to try and solve some of those issues. So, no complaint.
Chris, can I just mention one thing where I disagreed with President Obama and he disagreed with me, and that was on the issue of raising the gas tax. We knew that Congress was going to pass a transportation bill, and we knew that we needed a lot more money, and the gas tax hadn't been raised maybe since George Herbert Walker Bush, 1993. And I had recommended that the gas tax be raised. President Obama apparently, during the campaign, in a speech that he gave in response to Senator McCain saying that he wanted, if he were elected president, would raise the gas tax, and President Obama took the opposite position, apparently in a speech in Indianapolis. And I never talked directly to the president about this. I talked to Axelrod, talked to Rahm, and it became clear that the president was never going to sign off on raising the gas tax. And that was a bit of a disappointment because we really needed the resources we had really spent through the economic stimulus money. But the president was true to his word that he gave during the campaign, and I certainly respected that. The one thing that I had to do, Jim, the chair of the Transportation Committee, a long time chair, put together a transportation bill that increased the gas tax, and he came to me and asked me if I thought the administration would support it, and I talked to Rahm and to Axelrod, and they simply said no, and I had to deliver the message to him, which was a great disappointment, obviously. So I just wanted to raise that, so people didn't leave here thinking that, I was in lockstep all the way, that there was that issue, which was a big issue when you're Secretary of Transportation.
And
yeah, please,
I
go ahead.
also add one other thing. The frame of the conversation, we have talked about how difficult things were because of the economic crisis, and that the second term gave some more wiggle room to move. But I also want to counter with the fact that we got a lot done in that first term, in addition to stabilizing the economy. I mean, before, as we were working on the Recovery Act, there were significant numbers of bills that were held over, had been languishing, that we were able to pass. The child health reauthorization being an example of that. We passed the Edward M. Kennedy Serve America Act in addition to that. And then there was Dodd-Frank afterwards. There were autos. There were all these issues, some of them related to the economic crisis and others that weren't. But in addition to that, when we passed the Affordable Care Act, which was a significant accomplishment in and of itself, and one that presidents had been trying to pass since Truman, in that reconciliation bill, we also passed the largest reform of the higher education system since the Higher Ed Act was passed in 1965. And I remember when we were trying to do it, and Larry Summers was like, "Melody, you're not going to be able to get this done." I'm like, "Oh, but watch." And Phil Shalero, who was head of legislative affairs, said, "Melody, I'm going to save you some headroom in the reconciliation bill." And because we were able to pull out the subsidies that we were paying banks for direct lending, we were able then to reinvest all of that money into community colleges, into doubling the amount of Pell Grants, into a reasonable income-based repayment system that would help people that were struggling with college loans. So we were able to do all that. And then simultaneously, we also worked with the East Wing, with the First Lady, what was it, the East Wing? Blessed memory, the East Wing. We were able to work with the First Lady's office, who was driving forward her Let's Move agenda with a passage of a child nutrition bill that was significant. I mean, we're having a conversation now about nutrition standards as though people have discovered fire in the wheel, when in fact, those were things that we were talking about, moved as spectacular, and I say this because other people in my shop drafted it, report, and engaged all of government and communities in doing that. And the list goes on from there, while we also had to deal with the BP oil spill. Who forget the camera showing the oil flooding into the Gulf every minute of every day. So significant things were able to happen in the second term because there was additional wiggle room and the president wasn't running again. But there were, in addition to the economic recovery measures, also significant pieces of legislation and policy change. The work that we did on homelessness during the first term, I mean, the list just kind of goes on. And some of that legislation initially in those first 2 years was indeed bipartisan.
Well, go ahead, Sal.
Yeah, just to weigh in a little on what it felt like to be on the business side of the first term. The first time I met President Obama was around the Affordable Care Act. It had nothing to do with public land. It had to do with what are companies doing on an innovative way to cover all of their employees with health, which REI was doing, but with some twists in terms of, more than half of our workforce part-time, couldn't afford to have the full plan, but we had a limited plan for the day-to-day stuff where you could layer a catastrophic plan on top. The president invited 7 companies, I think there was one labor union, 6 companies in a labor union, to the White House. First time I'd met the president, first time I'd been in the Roosevelt room, as he was listening to interests around the country on how to pull the ACA together. And never seen, this is my first taste of his brilliance. 7 people spoke for roughly 4 minutes each. He took no notes. Nobody else was taking notes that they were handing him. He then had the press come in, was very gracious about telling us what to expect. Okay, this is like a scrum, and they're going to come in and they might look like they've just been camping in the park next door. They're going to be shoving microphones all over. The public's not going to see any of that. I'm just going to calmly explain what goes on. Just don't be moved by them. Just relax, and then they'll leave, and then we'll wrap up the meeting. But he proceeded to summarize each one of our statements better than we could have done, with no notes, just by listening. People have conveyed his capacity to listen and hear, and then convey that back to the public. So it was extraordinary. I'll also say that my predecessor, Ken Salazar, had to deal with that Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And the films that you all saw came from the U.S. Geological Survey, which is a unit of the Department of the Interior. And to say that there was a lot of trauma and a lot of frustration in the department because that consumed probably a couple of years of his tenure was an understatement. But, and it's still a problem, by the way, in the Gulf. There's still an awful lot of oil out there. It impacted a lot of marine mammals. Still don't know the impact of it. This is, this was a really tough first term, and they dealt with some really, really difficult issues. And so thank you, Melody and Ray. Although I will say for Anthony Fox, your successor, got really jealous because everybody loved him because he ran around handing out large amounts of money. And I was dealing with endangered species, and sometimes it just didn't seem fair.
I will say in Deepwater Horizon, it was a terrific example about using your cabinet in different ways.
Yeah.
So obviously this is a big deal. Interior plays a role, EPA plays a role. I mean, every agency plays a role. It turns out we have a Nobel laureate in physics in the cabinet as our Secretary of Energy, and Steve Chu. And so Steve gets sent down to, I think, Houston, wherever the incident response center is, and he can actually tell whether the cap is holding on top of the well because he's a Nobel laureate in physics, and that was not part of his day job, but it's one we used him for. We've got about 7 minutes left. I just want to do one more round of questions and just ask the same thing that Barbara asked us last night. Greatest accomplishment, Melody, and regrets?
I'm struggling. It's kind of picking among your children. I'm struggling because there are so many things, and we've talked about the fact that as we've been having these conversations, you are remembering all things that you forgot. But I can't do it. So certainly the ACA with higher ed, that was early, it was significant. I remember standing on the Truman balcony with the president. It's like midnight that night after it passed. Yep. And it was warm, it was a beautiful March night, and he looked at us and he said, "This is better than the election, because this is why we." And to pass that bill and to do the higher ed piece combined was significant. There was a piece of legislation, this is small for many people, but Tom Perez and I had worked on. Tom drafted it when we were still working for Senator Kennedy in 1997, a hate crimes bill. And President Obama signed that into law.
Matthew Shepard? The Matthew Shepard.
Yeah. So, and then the other thing I would add, I was on my honeymoon and the president gave a speech, and apparently because when I got back, everyone said to me, "Oh, the president gave a speech and you are going to go around the country and engage in the communities," because he, as he often said to us, the best solutions are not found in Washington, they are out in America. So we had a real community-based solutions focus that led to a task force that the DPC led. The First Lady was a member of it. Bono, I mean, it was a really interesting group of people were part of this. But the focus ultimately ended up being not only how do communities solve tough solutions, what's the data? What are we learning from the way they solve solutions in ways that are moving the needle significantly? And they ended up focusing on what then people call disconnected youth. Now we call opportunity. That change in narrative was part of the work we did. Young people who had dropped out of school, not finished high school, were disconnected from the labor market, disconnected from post-secondary education. We focused on that. Patty Stone Cipher, who had led the Gates Foundation at one point, and then Martha's Table was our chair. And the long story on this is that we wanted to continue that work no matter who came in to the White House next. We took it to the Aspen Institute, and now 12 years later, that work continues. There are government regulations that have been changed as a result of it, but outside of that, significant resources have gone to urban, rural, and tribal communities across the country, and we've reduced the number of those young people and that disconnection by rethinking the connections that need to happen inside the policy community and inside local communities on local, state, and federal level, and reduce the number of disconnected young people by over 1 million. And I am still associated and affiliated with that work and very, very proud of it. I think the place that I would hold regrets are places or times when I just wished I had said or done something more. I mean, there are always regrets. Every day, all the time. I remember there are nights I would be lying awake and I would wake up and bless my wonderful husband, like his face would appear over mine. He was like, "What's wrong?" And he would talk with me through a problem at 3 and 4. And you always wish I had just done something more across a whole.
Ray, we got about, quickly, grace accomplishment, grace regret.
Safety. We talked about safety in every mode of transportation every day. People get up in America. I've said this 1,000,000 times. They get on a train, a bus, in a car, on an airplane, and they don't think about safety. That was our job. Distracted driving. No one even knew what distracted driving was until we held a summit and convinced people that you cannot drive and text, and you cannot drive and use your cell phone. And distracted driving now has taken off more than we ever dreamed that it would. And when the Colgan air crash occurred in Buffalo and 49 people perished, when those people got on that plane in South Carolina, every one of them believed they were going to land safely. As a result of that crash, we created with Congress some great safety measures for pilots and better training and better rest. We talked about safety every day, issued the largest fine against a car company, Toyota, $32 million, which is the max we could do for a sticky pedal where 3 people were killed in one of their cars. Bottom line, safety has to be the #1 priority at the Department of Transportation. Very proud of distracted driving, and to be honest with you, I have no regrets about anything.
Love that. Sally, take us home.
Oh my goodness, in like 1 minute, right? So I'm thinking about what's sticky and what's important. There's a lot of things that we worked on, a lot of things that my predecessor, Ken Salazar, worked on around renewable energy and protections of lands, and that's all great. The thing I'd say I'm most proud of is really digging in and understanding our obligations by treaties with indigenous people in this country. When you look back historically at the treatment of Native Americans and the moving target where something becomes valuable all of a sudden, they get the short end of the stick, that is inconsistent with what was set up. And so I'm proud of really accelerating my learning curve by asking people like Kevin Washburn, who is Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs, help me understand. I'm being told to say I'm here to uphold trust and treaty obligations with our nation's first people. What does that mean? And he said, it's as simple as this, Sally. In everything you do, don't forget the Indians. And so President Obama stood up the White House Council on Native American Affairs, whether it was Anthony Fox, and transportation responsible for roads, or Gina McCarthy dealing with the impact of uranium mining in Navajo, or any other number of things. That became a place where, as chair of the council by virtue of the position, I could really put it on the radar of every one of the federal agencies. And so I'm proud of that. I'm not proud of, how long it takes to do that well and how much it's sort of 2 steps forward and 1 step back, and we continue with that. But I'll say President Obama visited the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe Reservation, and I was very involved in trying to address the challenges of Native youth and help fix the Bureau of Indian Education. Schools really was the worst performing school system in the country. 48,000 students, but spread across a ton of different states. We worked hard on that for 4 years. It's a regret that we didn't get farther than we did get. But President Obama said before he did his formal events with the tribe that he wanted to meet with some students. He met with 6 students who I met with in advance to try and calm their nerves about meeting with the President of the United States and kill some time so that, because, you never quite know when the President's going to get there. And what the students told he and the First Lady, and I was not in the room, he and the First Lady wanted to meet with them by themselves. And he came out of that meeting just about the same way people have described him hearing about the Newtown massacre. These students opened up, not all of them, but many of them, and told their stories. And so he came up to me, not in the moment, but at an event at the White House after that, took me by both hands and said, promise me you're going to try and do something about it. And I said, I am and I will, but this is a problem that is going to take years fix because it took years to do. But so greatest regret was not that. I'm proud of the work that I did, even though it still has a lot of work to be done. I'd say greatest regret, and it harkens back to yesterday, is not moving quicker and getting caught with a Congressional Review Act on things that I should have started early in the term, but I didn't know enough to do it. So the federal coal program, where we practically give away our coal with no royalties, and oil and gas regulation, which we worked hard on after the Deepwater Horizon spill. We got some of the stuff done before, some of the stuff done after. But the stuff we got done before was sticky because it's hard to do regulations up and it's hard to undo them. And we did it the right way. So a little bit of regret and positive in all. It took longer than a minute.
Please
sorry.
join me in thanking these individuals for their insights and for their service. Thank you so much.